the previous videos, we talked about different types of exam questions. So far, we have covered the theoretical questions. We talked about some examples of the theoretical questions, how the marks are being assigned, how to determine the specifications, and also the cognitive levels of the questions. It was mentioned that when we design the exam questions, we have to be careful while determining the cognitive levels of the questions. We need to really look into the nature of the question, the thinking order that students need to go through in order to fully answer the questions. It is not about the keywords. We can use any keywords. Some may not be appropriately reflect the intentions of the lecturers in terms of the assessment. Be careful if you have overrated some of your exam questions. Not only looking at the question itself, you will need to also look into the solutions given in the marking scheme. You can tell based on the solutions given whether the answers are literally from the notes and references or really something that acquired through the critical thinkings of the students. If you see the solutions given literally coming from the references or lecture notes, you will expect that the relevant questions is likely to be lower thinking orders, namely C1, C2, and C3. It is only when there are elements of analysis, which is very specific, case-to-case basis, that will be C4. As for C5, C6, you will require the critical thinkings from the students. Students cannot answer C5 and C6 questions without fully digesting the concept and principles that they have learned through the course. I see very often final exam questions are being overrated, either intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes it may be due to the lecturer having wrong understanding about taxonomy level. Many think that it is governed by the terminology or keywords used in the exam questions, regardless what type of solutions are being given in the marking scheme. This is not true. You will see some argument as well, especially when the moderator for the exam paper comment that the taxonomy level has been overrated. The respective lecturer still trying hard to convince the moderator that the questions are open-ended, as if they are asking for the higher thinking orders. My personal opinion on this, normally the relevant arguments is not valid. You cannot assume your papers or your questions is open-ended when you can accept the answers from the students literally from the lecture notes and the references. When the students copy the answers from the references or the lecture notes, and they can get full marks out of it, that means the students now have the advantage of bypassing the so-called open-ended question. In this case, no matter how do you argue, it is not really meeting the higher thinking orders. Let's say we imagine the most critical scenario. By looking at the questions, the entire class will know what topic is being assessed. Straight away, they can get the answers from their lecture notes. What if the entire class give you the answer totally similar to the references? And now the entire class has already bypassed the higher thinking orders to score the questions. In this case, what will you do? Are you going to redefine the difficulties of the papers? Would you still argue that it is higher thinking order? This brings to the next point. When you want to design an exam questions of higher thinking order, you will need to make sure that no students in the class can bypass it for you to rate the relevant cognitive level. If the students can bypass that, there will always be chances that the entire class never hitting that relevant thinking order, and yet marks are being allocated and awarded to the students. This will spoil your data. Where you do not know, students cannot do higher levels of question. Based on the result, you thought students can really answer really high level of questions that you have assumed, and this is not the principles of OBE. There will be bias, invalid measurement. The measured result is not accurately reflecting the actual situations. The result may end up to be positive, as if the students can do very well in your paper. What happened next? How about the following courses? Can they cope with the following courses if the courses is conducted in accordance to the actual specifications? You will have to consider the consequences. To strengthen my point, let me share you an example. This question is a typical theoretical question. It is about the contract. The topic is about the construction procurement method. If you look at the question here, a scenario is given. It is said that you have been hired as a contract administrative officer by an employer. Now you know that your role is a contract administrator. The question asks you to develop specific questions you will need to ask in order to assist you with matching project objectives and constraints in an effort to choose an appropriate procurement method. Based on the specification here, the intention is to access to level 5. Why is this level 5? Because it involves selections, choosing an appropriate procurement method. While choosing the appropriate procurement method, there will be a series of questions that you need to ask yourself before you can decide which procurement methods is suitable. The question here seems to be okay. It will be either 5 or 6. But when you look into the solutions given here, you know that the answer here are literally from the lecture notes. How can we tell? The way it is written, it is very similar to the typical lecture notes. It is also in the generic form, and the respective answer here does not have any elements of selection choosing. It is just a list of the question. So you can say that it is not really level 5 if the answer can be acquired directly from the references. Now you will need to check for the references. If it is true, everything comes from the references, that means there is no elements of critical inputs from the students. I would say the most it would be C3 or C2. You will see that many lecturers have a confusion, as if there is any scenario given, it is likely to be higher thinking order, which is not really true. You really need to analyze the questions and simulate the process that students go through while answering the question. It doesn't mean that when you have a scenario, it will definitely to C4, C5 and C6. Now we know that there are no elements of choosing here. We want to see if there is any elements of develop. If you do not have any of those in the lecture notes, and all these questions are coming from the students themselves, and different students will give you different solutions, different ways of thinking, This may constitute the developing part. If this developed part is available, then C5 or C6 can be justified, which obviously if you look at the marking scheme here, this is not really C5 and C6. Then this brings to the next question, whether theoretical questions can go for C5 and C6, or how C5 and C6 can be achieved if you want to modify these questions. The answer here is, it is achievable. Let's say now we just want to conquer this C5. C5, there will be elements of evaluations and selection. The students will be asked to justify their selection. We are still in selecting the procurement method, just that we incorporate the elements of selections, evaluations, and justifications. You can modify the question here, probably converting the questions into something like this. Again, it is a scenario. An employer intends to convert a piece of land into a tourist attractions, which is unique to Malaysia. For the construction procurement, he is considering the traditional methods and the design and build method. Because you want to achieve C5, that means there should be selection. Now you give the students two options to select. When it comes to the selection, you have to provide sufficient information. This will be very much governed by the conditions of the questions. It may end up to be one of these two methods. Therefore, the questions provide the conditions. The following are his conditions. He has little knowledge about tourism and constructions. He would like to package them together in a project. Second, he is inexperienced with the construction procurement. As a result, he avoids taking many risks in his project. Third conditions, he prefers that the project to be completed as soon as possible. And the last conditions, he prefers cost certainty at the onset, but does not mind paying extra for quality work. It may seem that this question is totally different from this question. But what you see here, the principles and elements are available, which has been embedded inside the scenario. For example, when we talk about the time, whether the project can be completed earlier, you will see the relevant information in the conditions to the questions. And then when we talk about the certainty of the cost before the project starts, now this is also a part of the preferences. He prefers cost certainty at the outset. When you talk about the risks, there are also informations about the risks. And when you talk about the complexity, this has also been captured in the question. Now, what do you see in terms of the different ways dealing with similar topics? This question is more straightforward. The thinking order as experienced through by the students is not that high. However, when it comes to these questions, the students will first need to understand the question. The relevant concept and principles has been incorporated within the scenario. Now the students will really need to read between the lines and try to grab those informations. In fact, you can have all the information messed up in the question. Make it a long passage, hiding the information here and there, so that the question looks more complicated. However, I feel this is not necessary. You have to go back to the fundamentals of the assessment. What you want to assess is the thinking orders. We are not talking about how difficult students understand the question. It is our obligations as a lecturer, making the questions as easily understood by the students as possible. The questions can be high thinking order, which at the same time easily understood by the students. This will help you to increase the accuracy of your assessment. Now let us proceed with the question. The following components of the questions, it will be very much dependent on the strategies of the lecturers. You can have everything in one whole questions, and this will ultimately become an essay question. When come to the essay question, students will have to find their ways to analyze and break down the components of the questions and plan their ways to answer the questions. If you worry that students cannot manage to go through this, as this is super high level when come to the essay, and you feel that you would like to help the students a bit to guide the students in solving the entire questions step by steps. Now this will be very much dependent on your strategy and your approaches. Some may argue that not to put too much guidance to the students in the exam, as you really want to test their critical thinkings. My personal approach is from the practical considerations. If you have been teaching the relevant course over several semesters, you will know that final exam, if you want to assess more component, that means if you want to assess more topic within a short durations of 2 to 3 hours, you have to provide certain levels of guidance to the students. It is unless you only want to assess only a few things or topics in the course, then you make it fully open-ended. In this case, there are quite a numbers of questions and all the chapters of the courses shall be assessed. In order to have a broader scope being assessed, I choose to compromise in terms of the guidance to the students. That will be the first aspects. We need to be fair to the students in terms of the time provided. Not just simply pursue for really super hard questions for the students that they cannot score. It's not really due to they do not know. It could be simply due to the exam questions or the exam system is not friendly to the students. Another reason that you may want to provide some guidance to the students, it will be you have the intentions to give an exclusive summary to the students during the final exam, where students may have all the principles and concepts memorized. You take your final exam as the last opportunity for you to help them to have everything sorted out. Normally, I have this purpose because you see the entire semester during the final examination. This is the only time that students will have all the relevant topics, concepts and principles in their mind. You can't have this anytime throughout the semester, only during the final exam. Why? Because they will study the entire course to prepare for final exam. So, at the same time, while assessing the understanding of the students, my personal preference, I will organize the questions, provide a little bit guide, help them to organize the knowledge, concept and principles, what they have learned through the semester, help them to appreciate the linkage of those principal concepts as a whole through the exam. With that, I choose to provide some guidelines to the students. Now the next question is, how do you provide the guides to the students? one of the simple way here is that we can break down the questions into several sub-questions. This provides the guide, and when you have sub-questions here, you will refine the specifications in terms of the taxonomy level, knowing specifically how many marks go for C1, C2, C3, C4, C5 and C6 respectively. Now let us go through the sub-questions. Compare the contractual relationship of the two methods. It was mentioned previously there are two methods here, and this requires the student to sketch and explain. Now it depends how you would like to define this cognitive level. If it is purely sketch and explain, it is likely to be C2. To be safe, you can declare this as C2 instead of C3 or C4. In fact, if you have component of comparing the two methods here, it can be C3 and C4. C3 it will be more towards applications. C4 it will be more towards the methods. To be safe, you can put it C2. At least explain is something that you are quite confident students cannot bypass. But if you would like to have some component of analysis of applications in their answers, probably you can go for C3 and C4. Let's say now you just call it as C2. This shouldn't be any argument on that. Next, go for the second question. You want the students to analyze the needs and the preference of the employer and propose suitable procurement method. Now there will be selections of the procurement methods. The two sub-questions here are connected. They need to first know what are the procurement methods, which has been covered in the previous sub-questions. And then they will have to decide based on the needs and the preferences. Then the deciding process itself is C5. There should be some elements of analysis, and your answer here should also indicate those analysis components. Let's say now there are two methods here. You will have to look into the preferences and the conditions of the employer. Translate those into the needs and preferences. Look into every single one of them and then determine the suitable method. You can say this process is an analysis process at the levels of the concept. You indicate the marks allocated to the answer. 1 plus 1 here means 1 marks here and 1 marks here. Having this alone doesn't constitute the selection. It is just analyzing the condition. Student will need to declare which methods is being selected. And you will require justifications from the students based on the one that you have chosen. Normally, when come to the C5, C6 question, you can allow for other logical and justified answers. Probably you can put a note here stating that other logical and justified answer or other approaches to do the analysis is also acceptable. Another thing that you need to make sure is that all this you will not acquire literally from the references. Students will have to think by themselves in order to come up with a mechanism to do the analysis. Students will have to select the relevant procurement method and provide their justifications based on the selection. What is found from the notes, it will be something like this. Not only that, the notes will give you the advantages and disadvantages of different procurement methods. they will have to relate all those informations in order to come out with their final answer. This shall constitute C5. Let's say now you would like to expand the questions further. You can add on other additional conditions. Taking this as an example, the employer intends to hire the contractor as the contract administrator for the project. This is from another chapter, and you would like to acquire the critical inputs from the students. This can be C5 question. Why? Because the students will have to decide whether it is acceptable or not acceptable. Not only that, students will have to provide justifications. So we will have to look into the solutions, whether it is recommended or not recommended. If it is not recommended, why is this so? Probably students will have to outline the responsibility of the contract administrator and justify why the contractor cannot be the contract administrator at the same time. It could be due to the conflict of interest. And probably you are expecting some answers on what should the employer do. The employer should appoint a third party as the contract administrator. And if you refer to the notes given, you will not see any of those. That means this one will have to be on the basis of the understandings of the students in terms of the contracts. And you can allow the questions to be open-ended, where the students may not answer totally the same as the one that you listed here, because the instruction here, it doesn't really guide the students. You are only seeking his advice on this matter. Now, if the students answer a different ways to justify why it is not recommended, the marks should also be given. What you see here, when you talk about C5, C6, the solutions can be quite open-ended. You're going to expect unique answer from different students. This is one of the ways that you can evaluate yourself after completed the final exam, whether you have overrated your exam questions. From the first glance or the first time you set the exam questions, you may feel that this can be a C5 question. As you go through the final exam, done the marking, you can verify whether it is truly C5. If you see a lot of students giving you really standard answer, that is definitely not C5 and C6. And if those answers are really literally from the notes, you will know that it's nearly guaranteed that the students can bypass your intentions to go for higher thinking order. With that will be your CQI. We are not penalizing any mistakes which unintentionally made due to lacking experience. Now, as you gain the experience through the course, you realize that there are rooms for improvement, then you improve accordingly. What I have shared with you are two different examples trying to access to C5 under the same topic. Just that the ways that the questions is being said is different. There are many other ways that you can achieve it. You don't have to follow this entirely. The ultimate goal of this is to show you that it is possible to access higher thinking order even though for theoretical questions.